Thank you for joining us for the North Central U.S. Current Condition and Outlook webinar. My name is Tanya Burnett, and I'm filling in for Doug Cluck today. We have Eric Hunt joining us today, and he's an extension educator of agricultural meteorology and climate resilience for the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And we'll let Eric do his presentation. And then you'll see at the bottom, you should see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. That's where we'd like you to put any questions you have for Eric, and we'll address those at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Eric.
Thanks, Tanya, and good afternoon. Welcome to the May 2026 North Central U.S. Current Conditions and Outlook webinar. So on the agenda today, we will be talking about the recent temperature precipitation across the region, recent severe storms, an update on water and drought, some discussion about ag impacts, and then finally we'll finish up with the outlooks for the summer and the very early portion of the fall. As a reminder, the next North Central webinar will be on June 18th at 2 o'clock Eastern. Dr. Aaron Wilson from Ohio State will be the next speaker. Let's get started off with look at the temperatures for the month of April, and these are the statewide rankings. So anywhere you see the red is the warmest on records. That would include most of the Midwest was warmest on records. That includes states like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Missouri. A bit cooler as we got toward the North Central region. North Dakota actually was a little bit below average with near average temperatures in Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. Looking at a countywide basis, again, most of Indiana and Ohio were record warm. A lot of Illinois and portions of southeastern Missouri were also record warm. A little bit closer to our average, though, so you got closer to the High Plains region with some below average noted up in North Dakota and portions of South Dakota, Minnesota, and Montana. For precipitation, it was record wet across Wisconsin and Michigan and was generally above average for most of the Midwest, well above average noted in Iowa and Missouri, merely considered average across most of the Great Plains states, including also Montana and Wyoming. We were somewhat below average in Colorado, also below average in Kentucky. Looking at countywide basis, though, we do get a little bit more information. So even though Nebraska, for example, came out around average, that does sort of mask that some of the southeastern portion of the state was above average and a lot of the western portion of the state was below average or well below average, which has been sort of the case for most of the last several months. Also well below average precipitation noted across most of Kansas, eastern Colorado, and then getting into portions of North Dakota. Wettest on record, though, for a lot of counties in Wisconsin and Michigan, and a smattering of counties in Illinois and Indiana and Ohio also had a record wet April. Looking at a little bit longer term picture, February through April, these temperature rankings are even more impressive than they were for the month of April. So everybody in the region was at least above average, most cases well above average to record warm. So record warm noted in Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, and second or third warmest across Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, and certainly top 5 warmest for states like Indiana and Kentucky, quite above average again for Ohio, Michigan, and Minnesota, North Dakota. Looking at countywide basis, again, you'll notice that where we had that ridge that was very prominent in March, where we did see record temperatures for a good portion of the southwestern U.S. getting into Colorado and Wyoming and Nebraska. A lot of those counties in the western portion of our region were the warmest on record for the February to April timeframe. Most everybody else was merely much above average. The closer you got to Canada, the closer we got to something that was just above average. And there were a couple of counties in the UP and Michigan that were kind of in the near average category. Looking at those 3 months from a precipitation standpoint, again, we were top 5 dry in Colorado, top 10 dry in Wyoming, nearly top 10 dry in Nebraska, below average throughout the entire Plains region, but above average across most of the Corn Belt, above average in Missouri, and record wet in both Wisconsin and Michigan. So it wasn't just necessarily the month of April that was wet in those two states. That actually had been starting a bit earlier in the spring, so very active weather pattern through a lot of the late winter and early spring. So those two states ended up with the wettest on record for those 3 months. Also noting Kentucky was a top 10 dry as well. So they're really for a lot of the last couple of months. We've had a very sharp cutoff along the Ohio River between who's been getting moisture and who hasn't, with the Kentucky side generally getting a lot less moisture than on the Illinois, Indiana, or Ohio side. Also pointing out that Colorado managed to be warmer in the month of March than in the month of April. I don't think that was just completely unprecedented. It certainly is very unusual. Now, April was still above average for Colorado, but was just less exceptional than the month of March, which was off the charts in terms of temperature anomalies. Moving to precipitation, 30-day precipitation ending on Tuesday. We do see that portions of southeastern Nebraska, a lot of the east central and portions of central Kansas, a lot of the northern two-thirds of Missouri, portions of southern Illinois, southern Indiana, getting to western Ohio has had tremendous precipitation. Also, some portions of southern Iowa and northern Missouri, I think, have set some precipitation records over the last week. Mount Ayr in Iowa, I believe, has had about 12 inches of rain between late last week and early this week. And there also was some massive flooding in a town called Trent, Missouri, where over 8 inches fell in just a couple of days. Much drier, though, across portions of northern Illinois, southeastern Wisconsin, and Michigan. So some of the same areas that were incredibly wet earlier in the spring have been much drier of late. Looking at percent of normal. So on the left, you're looking at percent of normal for this region for the last month. And the graph on the right, or the figure on the right, shows the percent of normal through the entire water year, which we consider to start on October 1st. And you'll notice there's a lot of orange and red on here on both maps, which indicates that we are at best 50% or at best 70% of normal. In a lot of cases, probably less than 50% of normal. So if we look at the water year, for example, from eastern Wyoming into a lot of Nebraska, we have had less than 50% of the normal precipitation that we would normally receive during this time period. Recently, we've had less than 50% normal across portions of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where we were very, very wet. Also noting some dryness across portions of northern Iowa. Very, very dry, though, also across North Dakota and eastern Montana, where we have seen some significant degradation on the drought monitor. More on that in a little bit. Recently, though, we have seen a lot better precipitation, though, across portions of Kansas into Indiana. So kind of the high 70 corridor, and then a secondary area of heavy precipitation from southeastern Nebraska getting into the far northern part of Missouri. Temperature departures the last month. So again, we were near record warm or record warm in a lot of cases for the months of February through April. If we start from about April 20th, looking through April 19th, we were generally either closer to average, in some cases below average, so generally within about 2 degrees of average either way, but generally above average from, say, Iowa toward the west, and generally below average from South Dakota and Montana east into northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, and the eastern portion of the Corn Belt was generally somewhat below average. But if we take a look at the water year as a whole, the only portions of the region had, or noting below average temperatures, would be portions of Ohio and Michigan. Generally, the temperatures are less exceptional above average across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana. They get more exceptional as you get further toward the west, noting that portions of western Nebraska have been more than 6 degrees above normal since the start of the water year. And as we get into Wyoming, we do have some portions of western Wyoming that are running probably at least 8 degrees, maybe in some cases almost 10 degrees above the long-term averages for that region. Very dry the first half of May, so we already kind of mentioned that. So it wasn't just Wisconsin and Michigan and portions of Illinois that have been really dry. So we've had really good moisture recently across portions of Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, getting into portions of southern and central Illinois and southern half of Indiana. But the first half of May was incredibly dry for most of our region, with a couple of exceptions, Colorado, and then maybe portions of eastern Illinois and portions of Indiana. Anywhere you see that 134 number, though, that is the driest on record based on data that we have from the Iowa Environmental Mesonet. Again, their calculations are probably just slightly different than NCEI, but in general, I think it would verify that for most of South Dakota, a lot of Nebraska, most of Iowa, and portions of Missouri and Wisconsin, it was the driest on record for the first half of May. And in addition to not getting much precipitation falling out of the sky, the dew point, which is, again, the temperature that we'd have to drop to reach condensation, the average dew points were very, very low for most of this region, averaging generally in the lower 40s to mid 40s across the southern portion of our region from Kansas getting into Indiana, and then generally below 40, or in some cases even below 30, as we get closer to the Canadian border or getting closer to Colorado or Wyoming. So again, generally speaking, particularly as we get into these central and eastern portions of Corn Belt, these generally would be much higher than what they were for the first half of May. We also have had a lot of red flag warnings across the Great Plains this year so far. Matter of fact, Darren Clavel pointed out to me earlier today that we have seen not record, but we've already seen more red flag warnings across most of South Dakota and most of Nebraska and most of Colorado than we saw all of 2025. Not sure if we've seen more than we did maybe 2022 or 23, but certainly we've had a very large number of red flag warnings, which has been reflective of the fire conditions that we've had across portions of the plains. Nebraska's already had a record number of acres burned, over 1 million. South Dakota, not entirely sure if it's a record or not, but they certainly have had a very active fire season with over 15,000 acres, at least 15,000 acres burned in the month of April. Fewer red flag warnings as you get closer to the Mississippi River, but certainly even some places that have been very wet this spring overall have had at least 1 or 2 days where the county warning area issued a red flag warning because of the low relative humidity, high wind speeds, and maybe warmer temperatures. We also have had a fairly active severe storm season so far in 2026 for some. So certainly I would say the southeastern half of the region's had a more active severe weather season. Not much to speak of so far across the western half of South Dakota, not much in North Dakota, Montana, or Wyoming yet. Climatologically, we tend to get the more active severe weather a little bit later in the season, so late May into June tends to be more active there. But we have been very active. In particular, Missouri and Illinois have been unusually active for severe weather reports in 2026. Illinois had a record number of tornadoes in the month of April with over 70 and is still at this point leading the U.S. in tornado reports in 2026. And for Missouri, only Texas has more hail reports so far this year. Rivers and streams, so kind of getting into water conditions. So anywhere you see the reds or oranges generally mean much below average stream flow, which is generally the case across the High Plains region. So noting some lower stream flows, particularly across western South Dakota, getting into Wyoming and Colorado and western portions of Nebraska. Where you see the blues, we're kind of reflecting where we've had a lot of recent precipitation. So a lot of blues here across the southeastern portion of Nebraska, getting into northern Missouri, and then getting into portions of Indiana and Ohio, which is where, if you see the black, that it's considered an all-time record high for that day. Noticing that even though we were super wet across portions of Wisconsin earlier, we do see a few stream flow values that are a little bit below average, kind of reflecting some of the recent dry conditions. But the northern part of lower Michigan still much above average, reflecting the precipitation that fell earlier in the spring. Soil moisture percentiles across the region. So anywhere you see the oranges and reds, I mean generally well below where we would generally would like to see soil moisture. So anything fifth percentile or worse would be in the red. Dark reds would represent second percentile or worse. This is based on the NASA Sport Lists model. So this kind of is reflecting where we are maybe shorter on top soil moisture, maybe are a little bit more, a little bit wetter. So again, wetter across Missouri and central Indiana, drier across the northern portion of Illinois, and drier across portions of northeastern Nebraska, where we did not pick up nearly as much precipitation last week. And so generally still second percentile or worse across all that area. And I also want to draw your attention to eastern Montana, northwestern South Dakota, northeastern Wyoming, very, very dry soils. And in eastern Montana, that's really more of a short-term signal. We've had very little precipitation up there in the last month to 6 weeks, and the soil moisture percentiles are reflecting that. Also note the Ohio rivers get kind of cut off, so much wetter on the Indiana side than on the Kentucky side, where we've generally had very low soil moisture for most of the spring so far. The previous webinars had talked about the lack of snow in the Rockies. We still are well short of where we would like to be for snow water equivalent across most of the central northern Rockies. However, we did finally get some decent snowfall in this region late April, early May. And some snow-till sites in Colorado had their latest ever peak snow on record, which is more a reflection of how poor this winter was for snowfall. Looking at snow water equivalent in the North Platte Basin, so North Platte on the left and the South Platte Basin on the right, we have been well below the average for the entire season. That continues to be the case, but things have leveled off at, I would say, are closer to or maybe just slightly above the historic minimums for this time of year. So we were not as quite as bad of a situation relative to climatology as we probably were a month ago, but still in very poor shape. And we are going to be dealing with some significant water challenges in portions of the high plains this year from the water melting in the Rockies. Looking at the Great Lakes, temperatures on the left. So Lake Erie so far has the warmest temperatures, which would be probably considered, typically would have the warmest temperatures at this time of the year. Coldest in Lake Superior also would be relatively normal. I do think that some of these temperatures, particularly at Lake Superior, Lake Huron, were a bit below average for this time of year, certainly compared to recent years. And the figure on the right shows the lake levels compared to last year. So Lake Erie being sort of an exception, but in general, most of the Great Lakes are running at, or in some cases, well above where they were last year. Lake Ontario is running well above last year for water levels. Okay, moving into lack of water. So the U.S. Drought Monitor, this came out this morning based on data through Tuesday. And eastern Wyoming, southwestern South Dakota, and Nebraska especially continue to be the epicenter of drought. Colorado also being there. We still have a lot of exceptional drought across portions of western Colorado. We have seen some improvements recently in Colorado and portions of Wyoming. A lot of rapid degradation, though, across the eastern portion of Montana. And we also, in recent weeks, have seen a little bit more abnormal dryness kick in across portions of Iowa and Illinois. And still noting seeing some long-term dryness up there across the northern portion of Minnesota. Again, as you go across the Ohio River into Kentucky, again into the southeastern portion of Missouri, we also have extreme, in some cases, exceptional drought in place at the moment. Generally speaking, though, most of the Corn Belt, though, is free and clear of both drought and abnormal dryness. Looking at change maps, the map on the left shows the 4-week change map. So looking compared to about a month ago, so the last time we had a webinar, if you see yellow and orange, it means we've seen a 1 or 2 category change in for the worse in the drought monitor. If you see green, things have improved a little bit. So in the Great Plains region and in Colorado, we kind of see a mix of both. More improvement in Colorado, the degradation, probably an equal mix of improvement and degradation in Kansas, more degradation in Nebraska. Thankfully, though, we did see some improvements on the drought monitor this past week in Nebraska. But notice, so we've had 2, in some cases 3 category degradations across portions of eastern Montana in the last 4 weeks, which is a very rapid amount of degradation for this time of year. Typically, if we're going to see that level of degradation, it would come a little bit later in the year. The one on the right is showing the water year. So again, looking at the traditional Corn Belt getting into Missouri, we've seen a lot of improvement. So we had a lot of drought conditions across Illinois, Indiana, and the western portion of Ohio. Last fall, we saw a lot of precipitation there in the last several months. So we've seen tremendous improvement. In some cases, we've seen 3 and 4 category improvements across the portion of the eastern Corn Belt. Whereas we've seen tremendous degradation across the High Plains region, the Front Range region. So we actually have seen portions of southwestern West Central Nebraska with a 5 category degradation on the drought monitor, meaning we went from D-Nada to D4 since the first part of October. Also noting the just rapid 2 and 3 or widespread 2 and 3 category degradations from eastern Wyoming all the way into South Dakota and down into the southeastern portion of Colorado and southern Kansas. Also noting a lot of degradation across Kentucky and southeast Missouri. That has had a very big impact on our pastures. So we generally have pretty good pasture conditions across most of the traditional Midwest, with Ohio reporting 0% of their pastures in poor to very poor, and lower single-digit numbers across Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and Iowa, and Michigan, lower teens across Minnesota, Wisconsin. You'll notice most of the Great Plains states in the 30s and 40s, over 60% in Wyoming and Colorado, and 83% of the pastures in the state of Nebraska are considered poor to very poor, with only 4% considered good to excellent. So we're dealing with some very, very challenging conditions for our ranchers out in the High Plains region, and a lot of them are having to make some very tough decisions with regard to cattle right now. This also has been a disaster for the winter wheat crop. So the USDA is estimating that the yield in winter wheat this year will be the lowest in over 5 decades. And this is a slightly old drought monitor map. This is released by USDA a couple weeks or a little over a week ago. And they're overlaying the dots where we have 10,000 acres of winter wheat with the drought status at that point. And you'll notice the majority of the winter wheat acres in this country, not only in drought, there are a lot of cases in severe and extreme drought. And even areas further east where we don't have the drought, we've had some freeze issues. We've also, at times, have probably had excessive wetness to deal with across portions of Michigan and Wisconsin. So, again, just about anything that could go wrong with the wheat crop this year appears to have gone wrong. Winter wheat conditions, again, only 4% of winter wheat in the state of Nebraska currently is considered good to excellent, and not much better in Kansas, Colorado, or getting down to the southern plains where we also have more winter wheat. Better further toward the east, but the winter wheat acres tend to be a bit less in states like Illinois, Indiana, Ohio than in the Great Plains. Winter wheat is starting to make decent progress. So basically almost fully headed across Kansas and Missouri, about halfway there in Nebraska, and starting to get there in South Dakota. Not there at all in the state of Michigan. But we do have a lot of drought in the country right now, but with the exception of Nebraska and portions of South Dakota, it is generally avoiding where we have a lot of corn and soybean acres. So I kind of make the little joke that is the drought scared of corn and soybean, because you'll notice that the majority of the corn belt is free of drought, and in a lot of cases also free of normal dryness. So at least at the present time, we have reasonably good conditions to contend with across most of what we call the traditional I states of Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana. Other planting updates, barley moving right along for planting across the northern tier of the country. So Montana to North Dakota, over 70%. Oats also good progress on planting, a little bit maybe lagging across portions of Wisconsin. Spring wheat also making good progress, maybe slightly less across North Dakota, almost complete though in South Dakota. Sorghum has been a bit slow to get started here across the Plains region, less than 15% in Kansas and Nebraska, and Colorado, a little bit further along in South Dakota. Corn, a bit behind Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, generally lagging compared to states of the West where we have at least 75% planted. Illinois, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, South Dakota. Getting them along in North Dakota, we tend to be a bit lag compared to the states of the South and East. Soybeans are running a little bit behind across most of these states. Nebraska and Iowa generally over 80%. That's more of a reflection of the really dry conditions that we had earlier in the month of May, where we were able to get a lot of field work done. Much lower on the soybean in Michigan, and also a little bit lower in Kansas and Missouri. I think it's also reflecting that some of the weather conditions there have prevented some field work. Same story in Ohio. In terms of impacts, even though we have been very warm, generally above average for the spring, so maybe slightly cooler times the last month, we have had some very untimely freezes. So on the map on the left shows the last date of a 32-degree freeze or colder. And you'll notice that for anything in green, basically shows that you've had a light freeze or worse in the month of May so far. And if you see a slightly lighter shade of green, that means that you've had a freeze at some point within about the last 10 days, which does include portions of the Panhandle of Nebraska, eastern Wyoming, eastern Montana. That also does include portions of north central Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin. So all this to say is that we have had some untimely freeze issues. So the picture on the upper right from Aaron Wilson is some damage to soybean in Ohio from a freeze earlier this month. And also we had some damage to winter wheat in Nebraska from freezes in April. Normally, sub-freezing temperatures in mid-April would not cause as much of an issue, but because of the really warm temperatures that we had earlier in the spring, the wheat was more advanced than normal, so it took a fairly big hit, which I think is also contributing to the low yield that we're expecting across portions, or at least the country being record low for the last 56 years. In terms of total ag impacts, so again, other than the drought issues, we definitely have had some freeze impacts in multiple states. So in Michigan, we definitely have noted impacts of peaches and cherries. We've had, I know at least Ohio and Nebraska, we've had some replanting of soybean due to freezes. I heard a story yesterday about some replanting of soybean in north central Iowa due to blowing dust damaging the soybean. Blowing dust in Illinois, I don't know if this necessarily was a tremendous ag impact, but it did close portions of I-55 for a short period of time. So that might have impacted people who are trying to move around from field to field. Prevent plant is a popular option in at least the western third of Nebraska due to irrigation issues. So this is definitely an issue on anybody on surface water in the Panhandle. And I have heard quite a few stories from South Central and Southwestern Nebraska of farmers that are also looking to do prevent plant if they have irrigation restrictions from their local natural resource district. We've had record levels of acres burned in Nebraska. We have had a very active fire season in South Dakota. In recent last several days, we've had some flooded fields in northern Missouri. And the picture from Kelsey Jensko from Montana shows that we've had some, in addition to it being incredibly dry across portions of eastern Montana, we've had some major dust storms. So this is from last Thursday afternoon in eastern Montana, just tremendous dust storm rolled through there. And there has been some major dust damage to cropping systems up in that portion of the country. And also got to know from Allie, Missouri, that there has been damage to fruit trees on the west slope of Colorado from the recent freeze. Again, those fruit trees probably were quite advanced for normal because of the insanely warm temperatures that we saw earlier in the spring. So I think some of the freeze damage that we have seen across the regions is almost a reflection of, yes, it was a late frost or freeze, but also we had a lot of fruit that was probably further along than normal because of the warm spring. Okay, moving into the outlook portion. The 8 to 14 day outlook from the CPC shows above average favored across pretty much the entire region, with above average precipitation favored across the western half of our region, particularly with higher confidence across the northern and central Rockies and High Plains region. Expecting below average or leaning below average, though, for the Great Lakes region, with expecting near normal precipitation throughout much of the central and southern portion of the Corn Belt. CPC hazards, again, they didn't have a ton of hazards to speak of here the next 14 days. They are expecting a slight risk of heavy precipitation across maybe the far southern portion of our regions. That would include southern Missouri and portions of Kentucky. And they are anticipating a slight risk for high winds across a lot of the High Plains and Rockies in the period of May 28th to May 30th. So again, I think we are expecting a more active pattern coming in later in the week. So that may mean some higher wind speeds with precipitation across portions of the western portion of our region, and also maybe looking at some very beneficial precipitation across some of the southern portion of our region where we have more drought. Moving a little bit further down the line, week 3 to 4 outlook. Again, this was released last Friday. They did not have a did not have an update today, but similar look on temperatures, generally above average, with higher confidence above average from the Rockies getting into the western Corn Belt. A little bit less confidence above average as we get toward the Great Lakes region. Expecting below across portions of Michigan, equal chances for above and below average precipitation for most of the Corn Belt, leaning above across the western portion of the Corn Belt and getting into portions of the Central Plains, and a little bit stronger signal on above average across the Central Rockies, getting also expecting above average across portions of Montana, most of Montana. Moving into the month of June, similar temperature look to the 3 to 4 week outlook, showing equal chances for above and below across the Great Lakes region, with increasing confidence for above average temperatures as we move west across the western Corn Belt, getting into the Plains region, and also expecting above average temperatures across the southern portion of the region in Kansas, Missouri, and Kentucky. Good news, though, is they are expecting above average precipitation across Colorado and maybe extreme southwestern Nebraska and southern Wyoming. So that would be very good news for the drought. And they're expecting equal chances of above and below average precipitation pretty much for the rest of the region in the month of June. Looking at El Nino, so the map on the left shows the sea surface temperature anomalies as of earlier this week. So anywhere you see the oranges and yellows and reds means sea surface temperatures are above average. So we are well above average for sea surface temperatures in the eastern equatorial Pacific. So we are already kind of experiencing El Nino type sea surface temperatures across that region. Still a little about average, maybe slightly cooler than average across portions of the central Pacific. So we are functionally already basically almost in an El Nino. I think we would probably be officially considered in one very, very soon. And you'll notice the figure on the right showing the ocean temperatures with depth for different pin tab periods going back to late March through the earlier portion of May. And you'll notice that we are seeing very, very warm sea surface temperatures as we get a little bit below the surface. It's are starting to come up closer to the surface, particularly as we get closer to the South American coast. So the expectation is that we are going to be in an El Nino officially here very, very soon, likely going to be in one for the remainder or the duration of the summer. And it is very likely that we will be in a El Nino as we head into the winter months. Again, those letters below indicate months. So JASB, July, August, September. NDJ would be November, December, January. You'll notice there's very, very slight chances of being in neutral conditions as we move through the summer and the fall, and they're showing no chance of us being in a La Nina. Furthermore, they are showing increasing confidence in a strong to very strong El Nino by the time we get into the fall. So the expectation is that we will be in a weaker El Nino as we head into the earlier portion of summer, with some probability that we will be in a strong El Nino by the time we get to the July, August, September timeframe, with increasing confidence that this is going to be a very strong El Nino, meeting sea surface temperature averages in that Nino 3-4 region, central to eastern equatorial Pacific, being more than 2 Celsius degrees above average. So notice that November, December, January timeframe, almost a 40% chance that we will be in a very strong El Nino. And basically, if you interpret that, 70% chance it'll be strong to very strong. So very, very high confidence that we are heading into an El Nino, and at least moderate confidence that it's going to be a relatively strong or very strong El Nino as we head into this later this summer, fall, and into this winter. The CPC June to August outlook is maybe somewhat reflecting of that. So the CPC's most recent update for the traditional summer months shows above average temperatures favored across the Rockies, getting into the high plains region. Equal chances of above and below average for most of the Corn Belt, getting into Kentucky. They are showing above average precipitation being favored concurrently, though, across Wyoming and Colorado. So even though we are expecting warmer, they are expecting a bit more of an enhanced monsoon, maybe an early onset of monsoon across the Southwest, which also impact Colorado, Wyoming, maybe the far western portion of Nebraska Panhandle. They are expecting at least a chance of below average precipitation, though, across a lot of the western Corn Belt, including the eastern portion of Dakotas, Nebraska, northeastern Kansas, western half of Iowa, and pretty much all of Minnesota. Now, again, that is in the lean below. That is not exhibiting strong confidence in below average precipitation. And that's a bit more reflection of that we do have some lingering dryness across portions of eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, and correlations in the past which show that if you are dry entering June, you do tend to be a little bit below average for precipitation across this region. But in general, they are expecting equal chances of above and below average for most of our region this summer. Looking a little bit deeper out there, July, August, September, the CPC does introduce leaning below, so not high confidence, but at least showing a chance, or maybe a slightly better than normal chance of below average temperatures across most of the central Corn Belt, getting into portions of the upper Midwest, Wisconsin down to portions of Missouri. July, August, September, continued favored warm across the Rockies, getting into the high plains region, with equal chances of above and below average temperatures elsewhere. Precipitation similar to the June, July, August, with above average being favored across most of Colorado and Wyoming. Taking away the below average, leaning below average across western Corn Belt and keeping it more across the northern Great Lakes region. And there does seem to be some historic precedent that would suggest that, at least in recent El Niños, we have been a bit drier across that northern Great Lakes region. But again, it's kind of showing equal chances for above and below average precipitation for the rest of the region, which is more a reflection of that even though we are heading into an El Nino, and sometimes the summer heading into an El Nino does tend to produce some decent precipitation for a good portion of our region. So on the left, this does show that we do tend to have a little bit better moisture for a lot of Montana down to Colorado and over into portions of Illinois and Indiana, maybe some dryness across portions of Wisconsin and Michigan. These are only historic probabilities, and this also is a reflecting of a moderate to strong El Nino during the summer months. The current prognosis is more for a weaker El Nino into the summer, so some of this may be less important going into the summer. temperature is showing some chances for below average historically across most of our region. Not many areas historically have been above average for temperature during the summers going into an El Nino. But again, just pointing out that in our region, our strongest impacts from El Nino, if we're going to get them, tend to be more in the fall and winter than early the following spring. So even though I think El Nino is going to have an impact on our sensible weather this summer, the biggest impacts are likely going to be coming a little bit later in the year. Drought Outlook shows that we do kind of expecting drought to persist across most of the high plains, Front Range, and Rockies. So it's maybe some improvement, though, across western Colorado into portions of Wyoming. Drought expected to develop across the northern plains and getting portions of upper Midwest. Again, you'll notice for most of the Corn Belt, though, they are not expecting any drought to form in the next couple of months. And we are expecting some drought improvement across portions of Missouri and Kentucky. Wildland Fire Outlook that was issued by the National Interagency Fire Center for the month of June. Again, still going to be fire issues across portions of Colorado and Wyoming. And I think until we really actually start seeing some significant precipitation, still going to have those fire issues across portions of Nebraska, South Dakota, maybe also getting into portions of Montana and North Dakota if we continue to see rapid degradation and drought. Again, the wildland fire outlooks showing above average potential across Colorado and portions of Wyoming in the month of July. Okay, so just kind of finishing up here. Drought is still a major problem across a lot of the high plains region. We've had a record number of acres burned in Nebraska. South Dakota has been very, very active. Even though temperatures have been a bit cooler of late across portions of the region, and we have had to deal with some freeze issues, February to April was the warmest or among the warmest on record for a lot of our region. The upper Midwest, particularly Wisconsin and Michigan, were historically wet earlier this spring, but it's pretty dry in that region in the month of May. And we may start seeing some dryness issues start to creep in the picture across portions of Wisconsin and Michigan going forward. The vast majority of the region was well below average record dry in the first half of May. For some places, this was very bad news for the drought. But for other places like portions of Iowa and Illinois, this is great news in terms of getting some planning and field work done. We've had a pretty active severe weather season so far this spring, in particular states like Missouri and Illinois, where we have been much more active than usual. Outlook summary, El Nino is very likely by midsummer. So again, looking back at those probabilities, it is near a guarantee we're going to be an El Nino through the summer. And there is a reasonably good chance by the time we get to the end of the summer, it will be at least in the strong category, and a very good chance it's going to be in the very strong to strong category as we head into the fall and into the winter. June expected to be warmer than average across the western Corn Belt, most of the plains and Rockies. And we may see cooler than average temperatures may come into picture as we head deeper in the summer, particularly across portions of the central Corn Belt and Great Lakes regions. Drier than average is possible in the western Corn Belt, particularly in the month of June and maybe July. We are expecting wetter than average conditions, though, across portions of the central and southern Rockies and maybe some portions of the High Plains region as we head into the summer. That'll be very, very good news for the drought. We are expecting drought to persist, though, across most of the High Plains region. We are expecting to see some drought development across portions or good portions of North Dakota and Minnesota. And here is the further information about our partners. So again, I would like to thank the Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers, NCEI, CPC, or Climate Prediction Center, the Drought Mitigation Center, the American Association of State Climatologists. And that concludes my spiel for the day, and I'll gladly take any questions anybody has.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A or in the chat box. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in there for us. Give you a couple minutes. You might have been so thorough, we don't even have questions.
Yeah, Eric, I think let's see. I don't know if you can go back to your 30-day temperature slide.
Sure can.
That was quite a ways back.
The June outlook?
No, the observed temperature.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. One of the things that people were talking about, and I've been hearing comments about, is uh, let's see. Yeah, the departure from normal temperatures aren't too bad, but the last 30 days, we're seeing that cooler in the eastern part. We're seeing people talk about some slower development of some crops and even grasses. So that this early part of the season where you want some additional warmth, and we're going actually the other way. It's not terrible, but we have heard comments about concerns on early grass growth just because of the cool temperatures.
Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, I see a couple questions here. The first one is you mentioned that El Nino typically causes a greater impact in the winter versus summer. Can you speak more to that in general terms about what areas are wetter and cooler versus dry?
Sure. So during an El Nino winter, we tend to see the greatest connections from El Nino in the southern portion of the country. So California into the southeast, we tend to be wetter than average, in some cases cooler. We can be a bit drier than average across portions of the northern U.S., which maybe would sneak into portions of like Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. But I'd say the biggest impact, particularly in a strong to very strong El Nino, is we tend to be very mild in this portion of the country in the winter. In some cases, we can be a little bit wetter. Some cases, we can be a little bit dry. But in general, with the strong to very strong El Ninos, we do tend to have a much more polar jet stream, meaning we aren't bringing the cold air from Canada and the Arctic down quite as frequently. So we do tend to maintain more mild temperatures in the winter months. So for our region, I would just say the connection I feel most strongly about would be that we would have a above average winter for temperatures.
Okay, I have another one here. Why are the Great Lake water levels so far above normal?
Well, guess, my best educated guess would be that that area has been very, very wet. So we've probably seen more runoff. And I know just from having worked with some folks in Michigan over the years on water, Great Lakes, height levels issues, like they periods of time they tend to be wetter. Those lake levels do tend to rise. In some cases, rise pretty quickly. So that's more a reflection of them as being abnormally to historically wet for most of the late winter and spring.
And
They also
some
saw a lot of
place
snow this last winter too.
that I was just going to add that the UP of Michigan had in some places like 12 or 13 inches of liquid water, not snow, but liquid water in the snow. So you put that along with heavier precipitation, and you do put a lot of water into the lakes there very quickly.
Thank you. The New York Times published an article today saying next year El Nino effects will be potentially among the most powerful in decades, if not a century. Do you have any comments about that?
Well, all I can really say is that there is a reasonably good chance this will be a strong to very strong El Nino. And the stronger the El Nino or a La Nina in the other case would be, that the bigger the impacts can be. So I would certainly say it's possible you could see some major impacts in the US and globally. But a lot of that's going to be really depend upon just how strong this El Nino is and exactly where the impacts are felt the most.
Okay, and I see one more right now. And this one's interesting. Some concerned fruit growers in central Minnesota about the considerable amount of high wind days and abnormally cool days coinciding with spring bloom timing, potentially depressing pollinator activity. And then they go on to ask if there are any tools or models that index together wind and temperature variables to give a general favorability rating for pollinator activity.
Ooh, that's a great question. So I do know if you go to the Iowa Environmental Mesna, which is run by Iowa State University, you can get some very good wind information from a climatological standpoint. There might be options on there to also combine temperature with it, so that might be an option. But it's also something that maybe you could speak with the Midwest Regional Climate Center about in terms of a possible future tool.
And
One of the things that people keep asking more about, and legitimately is for more climatologies about wind. And a number of different folks around the Midwest have talked about this and want the same thing. Unfortunately, the wind data, there's been differences in how wind has been measured, so it makes comparing across those different periods very difficult to do. So developing wind climatologies are a bit more difficult, and it's something we want to do and want to be able to create, but it's not as simple as what people are asking for. And that connecting with pollinator activity is a great ask, but that involves multiple disciplines that we would need to have several conversations about and trying to do. So it's a great question.
I agree. And I believe that's all I see right now. Before I forget, I did want to say that if you'd like to receive Eric's PowerPoint presentation, you'll need to reach out to Doug or you can reach out to myself and we can send you that.
And Eric, I'd like to pose one more thing about the summer. You showed potential for cooler temperatures in the summer, the interaction of that along with precipitation on what that could mean for crops during the summertime in relationship to drought and in relationship to crop development.
Sure. So if we do end up with having somewhat below average temperatures for at least a good portion of summer, that would slow down the crop development a little bit. Now, for particularly as we get into portions of Iowa and Illinois, that may be very, very favorable in terms of that means an extended grain filling period, which tends to be more correlated with higher yields. A persistent below average signal, though, further toward the north, though, would maybe mean having some shortages of growing degree days. That may be something we'd have to watch out for as we into the northern portion of the region if we do end up having more, prolonged periods of cooler temperatures across the region. And if we do end up with a situation where we have below average precipitation with below average temperatures, drought would still be an issue, but the below average temperatures would reduce the intensification rate of the drought, which that would be if we're going to have very dry, it's better for it to be on the cool side and for it to be, well, very warm, because that's really how you get the rapid intensification of drought.
And per the crop development, the only place that is really behind so far in the way of crop planting progress are those couple the Wisconsin and Michigan states, which have been wet. So probably something we want to watch up in that area. So I got nothing else from my end. Thanks, Eric. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. That was great. And our next webinar is, did you say it was Aaron presenting?
Aaron Wilson from Ohio.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. And that will be, I don't know the exact date without thinking about it, but the
June
3rd.
18th.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we hope to see everybody then. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.